Hello, you're watching the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. On today's programme, Britain on track for periods of 100% renewable electricity in 2025. A warning that the Arctic could be at an irreversible tipping point, triggering the disappearance of ice by the Arctic summer. And the climate change-driven frost that's chilling and killing wine crops in France. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world right now and meet those coming up with the solutions. Now, we've heard the warnings, but now scientists straight from an expedition in the Arctic say ice is receding more quickly than ever before. More than 200 researchers were involved in the expedition, in which a German research ship spent a year collecting data on the impact of climate change in the region. The expedition leader, Professor Marcus Rex, said he believes the Western Arctic ice shield will disappear if nothing is done. Well, joining me now is climate scientist Dr. Ella Gilbert. Dr. Gilbert, good to talk to you. That's a depressing verdict.
It absolutely is. And the fact is that polar science and the polar regions are the canary in the coal mine when it comes to climate change. The loss of Arctic sea ice is happening before our very eyes, and it sounds like it's continuing to do so if we're hearing it straight from the horse's mouth.
And do you believe that we've already gone past an irreversible tipping point?
Without seeing the data for myself, I wouldn't like to comment on that, but the situation is really clear. Arctic sea ice has been plummeting in recent decades, and it continues to do so. The less mitigation action that we take, the worse it will be. So the time to act is yesterday, and the more we delay and the less mitigation actions we take, the worse the future outcomes will be.
And what happens if we don't have an Arctic ice shield?
Well, the Arctic sea ice that Professor Rex was referring to, it's very bright and white and reflective. So the ice caps in general and polar ice in the polar regions reflects lots of incoming sunlight. So when we start to lose that sea ice, it exposes the dark ocean water beneath it, and that absorbs much more energy and radiation, which starts to melt the sea ice even faster. So it's this reinforcing positive feedback where warming causes loss of sea ice, which causes more warming, which causes more loss of sea ice. And this has quite far-reaching impacts beyond just the Arctic. It influences the weather in the Northern Hemisphere, for example, and it influences things like the ocean circulation. So it's not just a case of what happens in the Arctic stays in the Arctic. It's an effect and a phenomenon with really global consequences. Yeah,
the ripples go far and wide, don't they? Dr. Ella Gilbert, good to talk to you. Thank you. Well, in the next 4 years, all electricity in Britain could be 100% powered by renewables for a period of time. That's according to the National Grid Electricity System Operator report. Well, let's take a look now at our data dashboard. It shows us the real-time power mix in Great Britain. At the moment, you can see that 32% of electricity is coming from fossil fuels, 49% of it from renewable sources, and 19% from nuclear. But the study shows that at times that number there, that fossil fuels number, could be zero in Britain in 2025, meaning renewables could account for 100% of electricity during a period of time. Let's find out how. And helping to hit those targets, and indeed happening this very week. The world's longest undersea electric cable is being switched on this week, with testing already underway. The 720-kilometre interconnector will be used to trade clean energy between the UK and Norway as part of plans to cut emissions and boost offshore wind. Interconnectors supplied around 8% of UK power in 2019, and that figure is expected to double within the next 5 years. Well, wind power is a big factor in the push towards renewables and net zero. And as we approach COP26 and on this Global Wind Day, a new global wind coalition is being launched to encourage countries all around the world to urgently scale up wind power. In the UK, wind energy now provides nearly a quarter of the country's total power generation. Globally, wind energy capacity is rising fast. 90 gigawatts of new wind capacity was installed between 2019 and 2020 for a total of 743 gigawatts in 2020. Much of that growth was driven by explosive growth in China, followed by the United States. But this initiative aims to boost wind as a source of clean energy in countries traditionally dependent on fossil fuels. By the end of 2020, South Africa, for example, had just 2.5 gigawatts of onshore wind capacity. But by 2030, they want to increase that figure to over 14 gigawatts. Well, joining me now is Ntombi Ntuli. She's the CEO of the South African Wind Association. Really good to talk to you. I can describe the ambitions of South Africa there. How much energy currently comes from wind in South Africa?
Currently in South Africa, we have 2.5 gigawatts installed capacity, which is currently being generated and feeding into the grid. And we've got a pipeline of about 800 megawatts, which is projects that are concluding construction. And we have a very big pipeline for the next 10 years of 14 gigawatts for new projects to be built every year. Like other governments globally, South Africa has committed to a net zero target. And so how this campaign helps us is by joining forces with leading companies and associations from around the world to help governments to scale up their ambition for the NDCs and for climate action for COP26. So really, as we move towards taking more action and work together to scale up wind power to reach the net zero target, we are encouraging governments to step up and take more action and scale up their ambition.
Ntombi Ntuli, we talk a lot, don't we, about G7 countries and what they're doing in their move towards renewables. It sounds like we very much should be talking about countries like South Africa as well.
Yes, countries like South Africa are really joining the big countries in terms of the shift in the way that we generate power. We are shifting from a coal-fired generation to clean energy. We've got very ambitious targets as a country, which also follows a global trend, because we see it globally that there is a shift from coal-fired power to sources like wind energy and solar energy. And therefore, South Africa is obviously benefiting from that global action, but there is a lot happening on the ground in the country. We've seen a lot in terms of shift in the policy space. We have seen a lot of action happening, and government really taking action to scale up their ambition and to approve policies that were actually blocking the deployment of renewable energy.
Ntombi Ntuli, really good to talk to you. Thank you. Well, let's take a look at some of the day's other climate news now. And the government's being warned that its free trade deal with Australia could have a devastating impact on the environment. Green campaigners have raised concerns the agreement could lead to increased carbon emissions and undermine Britain's animal welfare standards. They say the government should not reward countries with outdated farming systems which are fueling the climate crisis. Wildfires in the Rocky Mountains are burning more frequently now than in the past 2,000 years. That's according to a new study by the University of Montana and Wyoming. Scientists there collected data from high elevation forests in Colorado and compared it with fire history records. They believe wildfire activity has increased due to hotter and drier conditions caused by climate change. And a London company has been named as one of the World Economic Forum's top 100 tech pioneers for their work to tackle plastic pollution. Polymateria has developed a biodegradable plastic which decomposes after a couple of months and is still able to be recycled during its usable lifetime. So even if it does get thrown away as litter, it will break down into harmless waxes rather than microplastics. Well, let's take you back now to that data dashboard. One of our top stories today, that renewables like wind could power 100% of Britain for periods of time in just 4 years. That's according to new research by the National Grid electricity system operator. Again, this here shows you the real-time power mix, where your electricity is coming from in Great Britain. And this here is what the University of Oxford tells us is human-induced warming since the mid-19th century, ticking up as we speak. We can also see the urgency. This estimate here suggests we have only until early 2033 before global temperatures rise by 1.5 degrees Celsius, the optimal limit as agreed by many countries as part of the 2015 Paris Agreement. And finally, this is the total amount of CO2 emissions, 2.41 trillion tonnes, again ticking up while we're watching it. And finally, wine production in France has been under threat from rare freezing temperatures this year. An international group of scientists have been examining the role of climate change.
It seems a bit counterintuitive that climate change is a problem with these frosts. And when we just look at the frosts in April, we indeed find that they would have been even colder without climate change. So climate change does lead to fewer frosts in April. Climate change also leads to higher temperatures early in the year, so in March in particular. This year in April, when these frosts hit, the leaves had already come out, so the buds had burst, and so there were a lot of young leaves that could be damaged. In a world without climate change, these leaves would have still be dormant and the damages would not have happened. This problem is not going to go away.
Well, that's all from us for today. Tomorrow, is the UK ready for the impacts of climate change? We look at the findings of a new report. That'll be at the same time tomorrow here on Sky News. Hope to see you then.